There is a kind of silence that lives only in the vast, cold places of the world, a silence that makes a person feel like the last soul on earth. It presses down from a sky the color of old iron and rises from snow so deep it swallows all sound. To survive in such a place, one must learn its language, a language spoken not in words but in the subtle shift of the air and the taste of ice on the tongue. Lynn did not know this language. She knew only the brittle snap of her own hope as it broke with each step. Her thin slippers, made for the polished floors of a distant home, were now soaked and frozen, her feet 2 blocks of numb pain. The grey silk of her dress, a simple cheongsam meant for a quiet life, offered no defense against a cold that felt personal, a predator stalking her through the skeletal trees. She had been left behind. The promise of a new life in a golden land had dissolved into a panicked scramble at a desolate way station, a confusion of shouting men and rattling wagons. In the chaos, she had run, not toward anything, but simply away from the fear. Now, there was only the snow and the encroaching twilight. Despair was a physical weight, pulling her down. Just as she felt the last of her strength failing, a sound reached her, low and rhythmic. The creak of wood, the plodding of heavy hooves. A wagon, a dark shape moving slowly along a barely visible track. It was a lifeline in a world bleached of all color. With a final, desperate surge of will, she stumbled through the deep snow, her breath tearing from her lungs in white plumes. She reached the back of the wagon just as it crested a small rise, its driver focused on the path ahead. Without a sound, she pulled herself over the tailgate, collapsing among sacks of flour and canvas-covered crates. She crawled under a loose flap of heavy tarp, pulling it over her shivering body. In the darkness, surrounded by the scent of grain and cold iron, she finally let the blackness of exhaustion take her. Thomas never looked back. The town of Redemption was a place he visited only when necessity demanded it, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled against the vast emptiness of the plains. He felt the eyes on him as he loaded the last of his supplies, the usual mixture of suspicion and grudging respect. He was a man who kept to himself, whose ranch was set so far into the foothills that he was more a rumor than a neighbor. They saw him as a man who preferred the company of wind and rock to that of his own kind, and they were not wrong. His silence was a wall he had built stone by stone, and he had no intention of letting anyone breach it. The faces in the general store, the saloon, the livery, they were all the same. They looked at his weathered face and calloused hands and saw an outcast, someone who did not fit into their small, ordered world. A man named Finch, whose face was permanently soured by resentment, had watched him tie down the canvas over his goods. "Stocking up for a long winter, are we?" Finch had asked, his voice laced with a familiar, grating insinuation. Thomas had only nodded, not offering the man the satisfaction of a conversation. He had paid for his flour, his salt, his lamp oil, and he had left. The town, with its noise and its judgments, faded behind him, and a measure of peace settled over him as the trail narrowed and the landscape opened up. His 2 sturdy horses knew the way home, their hooves punching soft craters in the snow. The air grew colder as the sun dipped low, painting the western sky in bruised shades of purple and orange. He was content in this solitude, the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels a familiar companion. The world was shrinking to the small circle of his own making, a place of order and quiet labor. He was completely unaware that the careful solitude he had cultivated for years had just been irrevocably broken. The silence of his world was now shared. The journey was long, the path a faint grey ribbon winding through an endless expanse of white. As night fully descended, the temperature plummeted. The air became so cold it felt sharp in the lungs, each breath a small pain. Under the canvas, Lynn had drifted in and out of a shallow, shivering sleep. She was no longer just cold, the chill had sunk into her bones, a deep, invasive ache that made her teeth chatter uncontrollably. A small, desperate sound, half cough and half sob, escaped her lips. It was barely audible over the groan of the wagon and the soft thud of the horses' hooves, but in the profound stillness of the winter night, it was enough. Thomas stiffened. He pulled back on the reins, bringing the horses to a halt. The sudden silence was absolute. He sat perfectly still, listening. He was a man attuned to the sounds of the wild, the distant cry of a coyote, the rustle of a mouse in the undergrowth. This sound was different. It was human. Slowly, deliberately, he turned, his hand resting near the heavy coat he kept on the seat beside him. His gaze fell upon the canvas top in the back of the wagon. He saw a slight tremor, a movement that was not caused by the wind. With a quiet, fluid motion, he stood, stepped over the seat, and moved to the back. He braced himself, his mind racing through possibilities: a thief, a stowaway from town, a desperate drifter. He reached down and pulled back the corner of the heavy canvas. In the faint starlight, he saw her. A small shape, curled into a ball, shaking violently. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it struck him silent. She was impossibly out of place, a fragile porcelain figure dropped into a world of iron and ice. Her grey silk dress was torn and stained, her dark hair spilling around her shoulders. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, a man who had forgotten how to speak to people and a woman who could not speak his language. He saw not a threat, but a terrified child. She saw not a savior, but a large, imposing stranger whose face was shadowed and unreadable. He did not speak. Words felt clumsy, useless. Instead, he reached down, not toward her, but to the thick wool blanket he kept for the horses. He shook it out and gently, without touching her, draped it over her trembling shoulders. The gesture was simple, practical, yet it felt monumental. He then returned to the driver's seat, his movement slow and deliberate, designed not to spook a frightened animal. He clucked softly to the horses, and the wagon lurched forward again, resuming its slow journey into the darkness. Lynn watched him, clutching the rough, warm blanket. It smelled of horse and hay, an earthy, honest scent that was strangely comforting. She had expected shouting, anger, to be thrown back out into the killing cold. This quiet, deliberate act of kindness was more disorienting than any rage would have been. An hour later, the silhouette of a small cabin and a larger barn appeared against the snow-dusted foothills. A thread of smoke rose from the cabin's stone chimney, a thin grey line against the star-dusted sky. This was his home. It was stark, isolated, and utterly unadorned, a structure built for function, not comfort. He brought the wagon to a stop beside the cabin, unhitched the horses, and led them toward the warmth of the barn. Lynn remained where she was, wrapped in the blanket, unsure of what to do. He returned a few minutes later, the lantern in his hand casting a small, dancing circle of golden light. He simply stood by the side of the wagon and looked at her, his expression still unreadable in the flickering light. Then, he gestured toward the cabin door. It was an invitation. Hesitantly, she climbed down from the wagon, her frozen feet screaming in protest as they touched the solid ground. He led her inside. The single room was spare but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a low fire burning within it. There was a simple wooden table, 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and shelves holding a few books and tins. He pointed to a chair near the fire. "Sit," he said. The word was rough, as if unused. The days that followed unfolded in a shared, almost monastic silence. Thomas rose before dawn, his movements quiet and economical as he stoked the fire and prepared a simple breakfast of coffee and oatmeal. He would place a bowl on the table for Lynn without a word, and she would eat, her eyes cast down. He never pressed her for answers, never asked how she had come to be freezing in the back of his wagon. He seemed to accept her presence as he accepted the snow or the wind, as a fact of his world that had simply appeared. Lynn, in turn, learned the rhythms of his life. She watched him tend to his horses, mend his tack, and chop wood with a steady, tireless strength. Her initial terror slowly gave way to a cautious curiosity. This silent man was not a threat. He was a creature of habit and solitude, and he had offered her shelter. She began to help in small ways. She would wash the 2 bowls and the single pot after their meals. She found a needle and thread in a small wooden box and mended the tear in her dress, her small, neat stitches a stark contrast to the rougher mends on his work clothes. One afternoon, while he was in the barn, she took one of his worn shirts, frayed at the collar, and carefully repaired it, leaving it folded on his bed. When he found it, he said nothing, but the next morning, he was wearing it. The silence between them was not empty, it was filled with observation. She learned the way he squinted at the sky to read the weather, the gentle way he spoke to his horses. He learned the way she would pause and listen to the call of a bird, the focused grace of her hands as she worked. A week after her arrival, he hitched the wagon again. He stood by the door, pulling on his heavy coat. "Town," he said, the single word an explanation. He paused, looking at her. "Lock the door," it was an instruction, but it was also an acknowledgement of the world outside their quiet sanctuary. It was the first time he had left her alone, a testament to a fragile trust that had begun to grow in the quiet spaces between them. The trip to redemption was a necessary evil. A strap on his horse's harness had snapped, and it was a piece he could not fashion himself. As he guided the wagon down the familiar track, he felt a strange sense of unease. The solitude of his cabin had been broken, but in a way that was not entirely unwelcome. The silence was different now, inhabited. When he arrived in town, the stairs were more pointed than usual. News, or rather, rumor, traveled fast in these isolated parts. Finch was sweeping the boardwalk in front of the saloon, and he stopped, leaning on his broom as Thomas tethered his horses. "Heard you picked up some strange cargo on your last trip," Finch said, his voice loud enough for others to hear. Thomas ignored him and walked toward the smithy. But the whispers followed him, clinging to him like burrs. In the general store, the proprietor's wife looked at him with narrowed, suspicious eyes. "Some say you've got a woman out there," she said, her voice a low hiss. A foreign one. Thomas met her gaze, his own expression unyielding. "I have a guest," he said, his voice flat and final. He bought the leather strap, some extra salt, and 2 bars of soap instead of his usual one. As he was leaving, a small group of men, including Finch, blocked his path. "We look out for our own here, Thomas," one of them said, a rancher named Miller whose land bordered the town. "We don't take kindly to secrets." "Who is she? Is she in some kind of trouble?" Thomas looked at their faces, a mixture of fear, ignorance, and a cruel sort of curiosity. "She is under my protection," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "That's all you need to know." He pushed past them, loaded his wagon, and started the journey home, the anger a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He looked to the west, at the sky. The clouds were a low, bruised ceiling, the color of lead. The air had a strange stillness to it. A storm was coming. A bad one. The men from town arrived 2 days later. The sky had remained a heavy, oppressive gray, and the air had grown so still that every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of snow underfoot, the caw of a distant raven. Thomas was splitting wood when he heard the approach of horses. He set down his axe and turned, his body tensing. There were 4 of them, led by Finch and Miller, their faces grim under the brims of their hats. They reined in their horses a dozen yards from the cabin, their presence an intrusion, a violation of the peace he had guarded so fiercely. Lynn watched from the single window, her hand pressed to her mouth, the fear she thought she had conquered returning with a cold rush. Thomas walked slowly to stand in front of his cabin door, placing himself between them and her. He did not speak, simply waited. "Thomas," Miller started, his tone attempting reason but edged with impatience. "This has gone on long enough. You need to tell us what's going on. The whole town is spooked. There are stories about a girl sold off the railroad, running from the law. We can't have that kind of trouble here." Finch spat on the snow. "Just bring her out. Let's have a look at her." Thomas's voice, when it came, was dangerously quiet. "You will not. You will turn your horses around and ride away from my home." A younger man in the group shifted nervously. "We just want to make sure everything is proper." "This is my land," Thomas stated, his gaze unwavering. "She is my guest. She is not your concern." The confrontation hung in the frigid air, a silent battle of wills. The men were armed, and they were 4 to his 1, but something in his stance, an absolute, immovable certainty, gave them pause. They saw a man who would not be moved, who would break before he bent. Finally, Miller shook his head. "This isn't over, Thomas. A storm's brewing. But once it passes, we'll be back. And we'll have the sheriff with us." They wheeled their horses around, their departure leaving behind a ringing silence, more menacing than their words. Thomas watched them go, then looked up at the darkening sky. The first snowflake, large and heavy, drifted down. It did not begin as a storm. It began as a whisper, a slow thickening of the air as the snow began to fall, not in flakes, but in a solid, silent curtain. Within an hour, the world outside the cabin window had vanished. There was no sky, no land, only a swirling, vertical torrent of white. The sound of the wind rose from a low moan to a high, shrieking howl that seemed to tear at the very logs of the cabin. The blizzard was not just weather, it was a living entity, a monstrous, white beast intent on burying the world. Thomas and Lynn were trapped in their small ark, the sounds of the storm a constant, terrifying roar. He kept the fire roaring, the flames a defiant spot of orange against the encroaching cold. He checked the seals on the door and window, packing small gaps with rags. Lynn sat by the hearth, the wool blanket wrapped around her, watching him. In his focused, methodical actions, there was no panic, only a deep, ingrained knowledge of survival. On the second day of the storm, a new sound fought its way through the howl of the wind, a frantic, splintering crash from the direction of the barn, followed by the terrified neighing of the horses. Thomas grabbed his heaviest coat and the lantern. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice barely audible over the gale. He tied a rope from the cabin doorknob to his waist, a lifeline against the blinding whiteout, and plunged into the storm. Lynn watched through the window as his lantern became a tiny, struggling spark, then disappeared completely. The minutes stretched into an eternity. She paced the small room, her fear for him a sharp, physical pain. She could not lose this quiet man who had become her anchor. Just as she began to despair, the door burst open in a swirl of snow. Thomas stumbled in, half frozen, his coat and beard caked in ice. A section of the barn roof collapsed. He panted, pulling off his frozen gloves. "One of the horses has a bad gash on its leg from a fallen beam." His face was grim. In this weather, with no access to a vet, a deep, untended wound could be a death sentence for the animal. He brought his supplies in from the barn, clean rags, a bucket of snow to be melted for warm water, and a small tin of salve. The horse, his older mare, was his most trusted companion, and the thought of losing her carved deep lines of worry onto his face. He laid out the materials on the table, his hand stiff and clumsy with cold. He knew how to clean a wound, but this was deep, and infection was the great enemy. As he prepared to wash the gash, Lynn stepped forward. She looked at the wound, then at the meager supplies. She shook her head gently and held up a hand to stop him. He looked at her, confused. She pointed to the small kettle of water boiling over the fire, then to the shelves where he kept his dry goods. Her eye scanned the tins and sacks until she found what she was looking for, a small cloth bag of coarse salt. He used it for preserving meat. She took the bag and a handful of pine needles she had seen him collect to use as fire starter. In her own land, her grandmother had been a healer, a woman who understood the properties of plants and common things. She had learned by watching. She gestured for the bucket of hot water, and into it, she dropped a generous amount of salt, stirring it with a stick until it dissolved. Then, she crushed the pine needles in her hand, releasing their sharp, clean scent, and added them to the water. She looked at him, a clear, questioning look. "Trust me." He hesitated for only a second. He had seen the certainty in her eyes, the same focused competence he saw in a skilled craftsman. He nodded. Together, they worked. He held the mare's head, speaking to her in low, soothing tones, while Lynn, her hand surprisingly steady, began to clean the deep gash with the hot, antiseptic solution she had made. The horse flinched but endured the stinging pain. Lynn worked with a quiet, focused grace, her movements precise and gentle. She showed him how to pack the wound with the salt-soaked rags, explaining with gestures that it would draw out the sickness. They worked side by side in the flickering lamplight, a silent, unified team against the raging storm and the encroaching threat of death. For 3 days, the blizzard raged, imprisoning them in the small cabin. Their world shrank to the life-and-death struggle of the injured horse. Twice a day, Thomas would brave the storm to check on her, returning each time with a report spoken more through the relief in his eyes than with words. Lynn would prepare the salt and pine wash, and he would take it to the barn. The infection did not take hold. The swelling around the wound began to recede. The mare was going to live. On the fourth morning, they woke to silence. The wind had died, and a strange, brilliant light filled the cabin. Thomas opened the door to a world transformed. The snow was piled in massive drifts, sculpted by the wind into fantastical shapes, glittering under a painfully bright sun. The air was pure and cold, scrubbed clean by the storm. The immediate danger had passed, but Thomas knew the aftermath could be just as perilous. Someone could be trapped, injured. The men from town had been riding home just as the storm was gathering. He scanned the landscape, his eyes sharp. Far in the distance, near a low ridge that marked the edge of his property, he saw a flicker of movement. It was a horse, riderless, pawing at the deep snow. His jaw tightened. He went back inside and began to prepare, pulling on his warmest clothes. Lynn watched him, understanding without being told. She packed a small bundle, the remaining salt, clean rags, and a flask of hot coffee. She handed it to him as he prepared to leave. He took it, his gloved fingers brushing hers. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything that had passed between them. He set out on his remaining horse, the powerful animal plunging through the deep drifts. It took him nearly 2 hours to reach the ridge. He found Miller, the rancher who had led the group to his cabin, lying semi-conscious in the snow, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. His horse had fallen in a deep, snow-hidden ditch. He was hypothermic, his face gray. Thomas worked quickly, using a blanket from his saddle roll to warm the man. He splintered the broken leg with a branch and managed to get him onto his own horse. The journey back was slow and arduous. When they finally reached the cabin, Lynn was waiting, the door open, steam rising from a pot over the fire. Together, they brought the injured man inside and laid him by the hearth, a silent, shared act of mercy for the man who had so recently threatened their peace. Miller woke to the smell of coffee and the warmth of a fire. He saw Thomas sitting at the table, cleaning a harness. He saw the strange, quiet woman spooning broth into a bowl. His leg was splintered and resting on a pillow. He remembered the fall, the biting cold, the despair, and then the face of the man he had come to challenge appearing through the snow. He was a proud man, but he was not a fool. "You saved my life," he said, his voice raspy. Thomas looked up. "The horse found you. We brought you in and my leg, it's broken. But the cold kept the swelling down. You'll heal." Lynn brought the bowl of broth over and set it beside him. She met his gaze without fear, her eyes calm and clear. He saw no malice in her, no threat. He saw the woman who had likely helped save his life. An uncomfortable shame settled over him. He had led the charge against these two people, fueled by the town's fear and ignorance. He had been wrong. Terribly wrong. 2 days later, his leg stabilized. Finch and 2 others from town rode out, their faces etched with worry. They had feared Miller was lost to the storm. They found him alive, warm, and being cared for by the very people they had ostracized. The sight stopped them cold. Miller, propped up by the fire, told them everything: the accident, the rescue, the quiet, efficient care he had received. "I was wrong," he said, his voice clear and strong, leaving no room for argument. "We were all wrong. This man, Thomas, he saved my life. And this woman. She is no one to be feared." The men stood in awkward silence, their suspicion dissolving into a grudging, then genuine, respect. Finch, for the first time, looked at Thomas without the usual sneer. He gave a short, clipped nod. "We're in your debt." From that day on, something shifted. The wall of suspicion that had surrounded Thomas's ranch crumbled. When Miller was well enough to be moved, the men brought a sleigh to carry him back, leaving behind gifts of cured meat, a sack of apples, and a bolt of warm wool cloth. They left it on the porch, a silent offering of peace. The quiet between Lynn and Thomas was different now. The space that had been filled with caution and observation was now filled with a soft, unspoken understanding. A bond forged in crisis and solidified in compassion. One evening, As she sat by the fire mending one of his shirts, he came and sat in the chair opposite her, just watching her hands work. "Lynn," he said, speaking her name for the first time. She looked up, a small, questioning smile on her lips. "Your name is Lynn," she nodded slowly. "Lynn," she repeated, her voice soft. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently covering hers, stilling the needle. "I am Thomas." Winter began its slow retreat. The iron-hard ground softened, and the immense drifts of snow began to melt, feeding the creeks that ran through the foothills. The world was slowly returning to life, patches of brown and green emerging from the white. The rhythm of their life settled into a new pattern, one of comfortable partnership. They moved around the small cabin with an easy grace, their tasks interwoven. He no longer had to speak to ask for the salt, she simply knew and passed it to him. She no longer had to guess when he would return from the barn, she could tell by the angle of the sun. The silence was no longer a void but a comfortable language they both understood. The soft romance that had been a fragile seed was now a quiet, sturdy bloom. It was in the way he brought her a small, resilient wildflower he found pushing its way through the snow. It was in the way she saved him the best part of the stew, placing it in his bowl without comment. One afternoon, they stood on the small porch, watching the last vestiges of winter drip from the eaves of the barn. The air was warmer, carrying the scent of damp earth and the promise of spring. He had been quiet for a long time, his gaze on the distant mountains, now clear and sharp against a blue sky. Lynn stood beside him, her presence a source of warmth that had nothing to do with the rising temperature. She had found more than just survival in this harsh, beautiful land, she had found a place of belonging. He had found more than just a guest, he had found the missing piece of his own quiet heart, a piece he hadn't even known was gone. He turned to look at her, at the way the light caught in her dark hair and the calm strength in her eyes. The journey that had begun with a desperate act of survival, a mistake born of fear, had led them here. To this peace. To this shared life. He thought of that cold night, the discovery in the back of his wagon, and how the entire course of his solitary existence had changed in that single moment. A soft smile touched his lips, a rare sight. He leaned closer, his voice a low whisper, meant only for her. "Best wrong turn you ever made."